Pastor, thank you. Well, good morning. Isn't it nice to be in the house of the Lord? You know, Gary spoke this morning about Mr. Universe. I used to be Mr. Universe, but I got wet and shrunk. I am no authority on Christ or religion. I can only tell you what is in here and what I feel and believe in my heart. That's all I can do. And that's what I'm going to do this morning. Our families in America, it seems to me, being one of 11, we stuck pretty close together because we had to help one another. But our families seem to be drawing apart. I don't know whether it's distance or what it is. I don't have the answer to that. I just know that it's happening. I just spoke to 158 high school 16 to 18-year-olds in a school we call Challenge Academy. These young folk in high school or junior high weren't getting it. They weren't doing it. They weren't listening to the teacher. They weren't attending. They weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And somebody encouraged them to go to this challenge school. It's been going on for several years. It's 22 weeks in length. It is very military. They march where they go. They learn to say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, in very firm voices. 80% of those youth in that academy are single-family youth. There's something wrong with that. It reminds me of the story of the older folk, and we are some older folk in here, aren't we? But they used to enjoy going out on the porch swing on the porch in the summertime and sit there and swing back and forth and say how proud they were of their family and what a good life they had and how much they loved each other and all of that. And they were doing that one evening, and the wife leaned over and said to the husband, "Do you remember when we used to say to each other, 'I love you so much'? And you would say back to me, 'You love me.' And then you would just reach over and nibble on my ear." And he jumped up and started in the house, and she said, "Wait a minute, what did I do? Make you mad?" "No, you didn't make me mad, but if I'm going to nibble on your ear, I got to go get my teeth." Last evening, the pastor spoke very forcefully and encouragingly about heaven. I suppose if you did a survey and asked everybody if they really told the truth, did they want to go to heaven, I doubt seriously if anybody would raise their hand and say, "No, I don't want to go there." They probably would raise their hand. But I want you to know that I am from the great state of West Virginia, which is almost heaven. John Denver said so, you know. And I believe John Denver. There was a Sunday school teacher trying to explain to her class what it is and how it is to get to heaven. And she said, "If I go to church every Sunday and I pay attention to what the preacher says, will that get me into heaven?" And all the children together said, "No." And she says, "Well, if I'm good to the preacher, And if I teach a Sunday school class, and I do all the nice things, maybe mow the lawn of the church, will that get me into heaven? No. Well, she said, if I clean the church and I care for people, will that do it? And again, they said, no. Well, she said, well, then, what do I have to do to get to heaven? The little boy in the back of the room jumped up and raised his hand. And he said, move to West Virginia. Another teacher asked the class, how many of you want to go to heaven? Everybody raised their hand except one little girl. Sally didn't put up her hand. And she says, well, Sally, don't you want to go to heaven? And she says, yes. But I want to go home and see Grandma first because she's coming to visit. But we all want that. At least we should. A church was getting a new pastor, and no one knew him. Probably the pastor has been through this, very anxious moments when you go to a new church. Now, in our in our society, and in my church life, we don't get to pick our preacher. Somebody else picks him and sends him to us. So they were getting a new pastor at this church, and no one knew him. Really hadn't even heard tell of him. But he put out the word and special notice that he was going to do something very special on his first Sunday in church. Advertised it quite greatly. So on the day that he was to be there, out of curiosity, we are curious people. Church was packed, first time for a long, long time. But everybody got seated, and now they're whispering each other. Where's the pastor? Wonder what he's going to do. Anybody know him? All of a sudden, he pops out the side door, and he's dressed like the devil. And he begins yelling, I got you. I got every one of you. There's no way you can escape me. Some old World War II guy about my age, about half deaf as I am, said to him, who'd you say you are? He said, I'm the devil. You ought to know me. He said, well, I don't, but I'm sure glad to meet you because I'm married to your sister. When I think of the earlier years, I have to wonder what happened to the reverence of God. I can remember when I first got involved in church in 1962, and prior to that, you couldn't get me in a church with a shotgun. My wife, I believe, was born a Christian. That's all she ever knew. Aggravated me some. She raised our daughters as Christian children. She took them to Sunday school, church. Would I go? Yeah. I'm a Marine. I don't need God. I'm self-sufficient. How stupid can one get? One Easter, the girls had been saying, come on, Dad, let's go to church. Back at Easter time, at that time, maybe you still do it over here, but over there we have sort of lost our tradition. We used to dress all of our, particularly the girls, in beautiful new dresses, and a bonnet. I think we called it a bonnet. New shoes, new outfit. I used to get aggravated at my wife spending all that money just for one Sunday. But they finally got to me and just harassed me and harangued me until I said, okay, I'll go. So we went to church, but when I walked in, we only had one door. You guys are lucky. You got 3 you can escape out of. We only had one door. I walked in about 5 or 6 rows down and sat right on the aisle. I made my wife and the children go in first, because if I had to get out of here, I've got a route of escape. So I'm sitting there, have no idea what's going on, really. Our pastor was 6'6", and when he was up in the pulpit, he looked like a giant. His hands, one of his would make 2 of mine. Been a pastor, been a Christian since he was 12 years old. At that time, made up his mind he was going to be a preacher. And he was a good one. And he began preaching about Christ being nailed to the cross. And it seemed like he didn't look at anybody but me. And he reached that point in his sermon where he said, and you, I'll swear he pointed at me, and I didn't have anything to do with that. But he said, you helped drive the nails in his hand. See, I'd had 2 Marines, as I mentioned last night, who gave their lives for mine. And when he said that Christ died for me, that he gave his life for me, God spoke to me. And I had no more control of what I did than the man in the moon, if he's up there. I got up out of my pew, not my pew, church pew, and I walked up right in front of that great big tall guy, and the closer I got, the bigger he looked. And he's right in the middle of his sermon, and he stopped and looked down at me, and he was just as much surprised as I was, I think. He said, can I do something for you? And I said, yes. Would you pray with me? And we knelt at the altar. And when I went out that door, I left a new man. Not the same guy. Never smoked another cigarette and never took another drink in my life. But when I think of what has happened to the reverence of God, can't pray in schools. No longer do we have to stand to say the Pledge of Allegiance. It's our option. We don't have to do it now. We don't have to say one nation under God anymore. The United States Air Force Academy has made it optional if those cadets want to say one nation under God. Our military chaplains can no longer pray in the name of Jesus Christ, even though they know that young man or young woman may be going to see him very soon. They can't keep a Bible on their desk. In my church for a while, the old-time hymns went out the window, and we began singing songs I couldn't understand, and the music was so loud I couldn't even hear the words. And we got rid of that preacher. He's no longer there. Could we, at this moment, be very, very quiet? Just for a few moments. And see if you can feel the presence of God. I do. The hair on the back of my neck standing up. He's here. Oh, if we could just have some of our old-time, absolute believing people like James Madison, who on July the 23rd, 1813, he issued a proclamation with the concurrence of Congress. They asked him to do it. A day of public humiliation and prayer. I wonder if we tried that today, what would happen? When we look back at our heritage and the way of life of those who formed America, and we say we do not belong, or we are not a Christian nation, or that God is no part of our being, we are really saying, I don't want to be an American. Because you can't be unless those other things are true. And if that's true, then as far as I'm concerned, that person ought to get out of Dodge. To me, it's like saying, I do not want to be a part of my own family. Yet we know that acting holy does not a Christian make. However, we do realize that we must have a relationship with Jesus as our Savior, and that is the only way we are going to get to heaven. There ain't no other way. And he made it very clear and very plain that that was necessary. Pastor was visiting one of his members in a assisted living home, and I tell this because we're tempted in so many ways. And it really takes a lot of, I don't know whether it's courage or tenacity or whatever it is, but it takes a lot of whatever to get away from those temptations. I have them, I see them, and I sometimes have a difficult time not participating. But he had gone to see this lady, and he is a pastor that loved peanuts. And they were one of his main temptations. Every time he got close to peanuts, something happened. He had to have peanuts. Well, on a little table beside her bed was a bowl of peanuts. Well, she was asleep when he got there, so he sat there and waited and waited and waited, and she continued to sleep and snore a little bit. And he kept looking at those peanuts. Finally, that old devil, that temptation, just grabbed him, and he started eating those peanuts, and he sat there and ate every one of them. So in a little while, she woke up, and naturally he greeted her and told her that he'd been waiting for her to wake up, and said, I want to apologize to you because I sat here and ate all your peanuts, but I'll get you some more. I'll refill your bowl. And she said, oh, that's all right. I don't like peanuts anyhow. She says, I just sucked the chocolate off of them. sometimes temptation gets in our way. Yeah. There's a story of a Marine squad in Iraq. They had been in the attack for some time, and finally they encountered more than they could handle. And in the Marine Corps, the word retreat is not part of the vocabulary, right? Chesty Puller said, one of our great warriors, we never retreat, we just advance to the rear. I like that better. But they'd been in the attack, and finally they ran into more than they could handle, and they finally had to withdraw. And as they were, one of their Marines was severely wounded. They couldn't get him. And you know, every branch of service has this belief and this philosophy: we do not leave anybody behind. When they got back to a more protected area, one of the Marines realized that it was his buddy, the guy he'd raised up with, grew up with in the community, went to high school with, played football with, joined the Marine Corps with, served with ever since he'd been in the Marine Corps. That was the guy. That was the Marine. So he said to his commanding officer, "Can I go back and get him?" And he said, "Well, no, you can't go back there. It's suicide for you to go back in there." But that Marine didn't accept that. As Gary said this morning, he wasn't thinking of himself. So without permission, he took off. And in a little while, he came back and he was carrying his buddy. And the commanding officer was very furious with him, and he said, "I told you, you couldn't go, and I told you that he was probably dead already." And the Marine said, "But sir, when I got to him, he wasn't. He was still alive. And the very last words that he said to me was, 'I knew you would come back for me.'" See, that's what Christ is telling us. I will come back for you. But if it happens before, I'm waiting for you. I'm here. There was a Vietnam veteran. Gary knows this so well that I don't even have to say it. We didn't treat those guys right. Not all of us. No, I'm not guilty. But there were a few people in America that did not treat them well. And that's what the news people talk about. Not the good things, but the bad. This guy's name was Earl Price, and he was severely abused as a child by an older brother. And finally, he could just take it no longer. So he talked his other brother next to him to help him kill the older brother. So they got a shotgun. One held the barrel and the other squeezed the trigger. And they killed the older brother because of the abuse. But they ruled it was an accidental happening, so nothing happened to the two boys, physically or lawfully. But something did happen to the two boys. He was drafted eventually, the son was, or the brother, and he ended up in Vietnam. He had never seen a Bible in his life. He had never been in a church. And his life values, or the values of his life, just didn't exist. He didn't have any. Killing another human being had absolutely no impact on him. One day he entered a grass hut to escape a severe storm, and as he got in there, he looked over in the corner, and over there was some little thing, black. He first thought it was a booby trap, but he finally built up enough courage to check it out, and he worked his way over to it, and it was a little black Gideon Bible. And for unknown reasons, oh, God knew, but he didn't, he picked it up and stuck it in his pocket. Later, by flashlight, he began reading it. It had no meaning to him. He couldn't understand the words in it, new words that he had never heard before. But he liked the stories, because usually they were good stories. There were achievements and winnings. He liked that. As he was sitting there or lying there reading this Bible, he had a mosquito net over his bunk, and a great big black spider, the biggest black spider he said he'd ever seen in his life, started coming down from that mosquito net, and he looked up and saw it. He finally wiggled his way out of his bunk without disturbing that black spider right there. And as he got out, the spider dropped onto the bunk. He ran over and got his .45 and came back and shot the thing 3 times. It was a dead spider, all right, but 3 holes in his bunk. Later, he was severely wounded. Spent months in the hospital. But he finally got home. And then he did something that he had never done in his life. He went to church. But, sounds like me, he was by himself. When he came in, he sat on the last bench. Didn't have pews in this little church, just a bench. And he sat on the last bench right next to the door. So if he had to get out of there, he had a way of escaping. He said the preacher let his message fly that night. It was hell hot and heaven glorious. And he had never heard anything like that before in his life. And he had never thought about heaven. He'd never thought about hell. Those words were not in his vocabulary. But the next Wednesday, he decided to pray for the very first time in his life. Now, I've always said you can't bargain with God. You can't say, I'll do this if you'll do that. He's not going to bargain that way. But you can make a promise to him, and that's what he did. He said, if you let me live until next Sunday, then I'll go back to church. Well, Sunday came. His wife and his mother were both sick. The goldfish had died. The bird was dead in its cage. He had every reason in the world not to go to church. But his brother-in-law came along, knocked on the door and said, let's go to church. Well, he was driving one of those little Volkswagens. And he had had surgery not too long before he came home. He still had his stitches. So trying to get in that little Volkswagen was painful, and he finally decided, I can't get in there, that little car. And his brother-in-law said, well, just sit out there on the front. It's not very far to church. Well, that's the way they went to church. Him riding out there on the front. Well, he went to the same seat that he'd been on before, that last bench back there. But some lady came in, and he had manners. So she said, scoot over. So he scooted over and let her sit down. Now she's between him and the door. The preacher, he said, preached the same sermon that Sunday that he preached the last Sunday. You don't do that, do you? Finally, they got to the song of invitation. It only had 4 verses. They were on the 3rd verse. He said to the lady sitting beside him, pardon me, ma'am, but she didn't move. So he said, I just elbowed her off of the end of the bench, and she fell on the floor. And I got up and walked up the aisle. And he said, my brother-in-law thought I was going to create a problem, so he ducked his head so nobody would see him or have him think he had anything to do with this. The preacher was a little uneasy too when he saw me coming. But he said, then, can I help you? Just like mine did. He said, I began explaining all that I was going through. He opened the Bible and he showed me a few verses, and a few moments later, I found a peace I had never known. Earl Price was sent to Germany, where he saw firsthand how people were denied access to the Bible and the worship of God. He saw elderly people who would walk for miles in the snow and stand in the woods to hear someone read the Bible or preach a message. They would do almost anything to get their hands on a piece of Scripture. One group made a printer out of a washing machine and bicycle parts so that they could print pages of the Scripture. And none of us can imagine what it would be like to be denied the right to have a Bible or to go to church. We can't imagine that. Not in America. One little boy was asked, who is your hero? He said, my hero is Moses, standing at the Red Sea, telling the children of Israel to stand tall and see the salvation of the Lord. He's my hero. We are told that every action has a reaction. And God depends on us to act first. He's not a dictator. He does not force his will in our lives. He is a loving Father. And to have God in my life, I had to act first. I had to get out of that pew and walk to the front of that church, or I would not be here today. I cannot begin to tell you the blessings that have come to my life as a result. Some of the older folk in this room will remember, or in this sanctuary, will remember when Grandma and Grandpa years ago would pour a cup of coffee, and then they would pick up the cup and they would pour a little coffee in the saucer. And then they would pick up the saucer and they would blow across it to cool the coffee, and then they would drink from their saucer. I can remember my folks doing that. My grandma never knew a grandpa, but I can remember that. I'm going to close with a poem that nobody knows the author to. Just says I'm drinking from a saucer. I never made a fortune, and it's probably too late now. But I don't worry about that much because I'm happy anyhow. As I go along life's way, I'm reaping better than I sowed. I'm drinking from a saucer because my cup has overflowed. Haven't got a lot of riches. And sometimes the going's tough. But I've got loving ones around me, and that makes me rich enough. I thank God for his blessings and for the mercies he's bestowed, because I'm drinking from a saucer, because my cup has overflowed. I remember times when things went wrong and my faith wore somewhat thin. But all at once the dark clouds parted and the sun peeped through again. So Lord, help me not to gripe for the tough rows that I have hoed. I'm drinking from the saucer because my cup has overflowed. If God gives me strength and courage when the way grows steep and rough, I'll not ask for other blessings. I'm already blessed enough. And may I never be too busy. Could I say that again? And may I never be too busy to help others with their loads. Then I'll keep drinking from my saucer, because my